Hey folks, it's Phelan McPhalen. Happy Thursday, happy October. It's getting to the cool weather here in Dallas. I know we have a kind of an Indian summer day today, but it's getting cooler gradually, so I'm happy about that. I was thinking about what to do today, and I was thinking about that concept of the harvest being the end of the age, and of those parables that Christ gave in Matthew chapter 13, those parables concerning the end of the age and concerning the course of this age, and how some preterists, especially full preterists, how they always interpret all that. They kind of squeeze all that into a 40-year context. And at 40 years, I've done podcasts before, within the past couple of months, about 40 years in the wilderness, how the 40 years of Moses from AD 30 to AD 70, and how each wilderness period was followed by a period of land entrance, really, really important. And how we get the anti-typical fulfillment, we have to draw those from the types, not vice versa. So we don't get to make things up as we go along. We have to interpret according to the actual types that are laid down in the Old Testament. There has to be biblical precedence. This is not something we can just pull out of our hats and make up as we go along. But I was thinking about that whole concept of harvest, and it occurred to me, I was reading some comments the other day, and it occurred to me that they were not allowed to sow, to plant, or to reap anything while they were still in the wilderness. And all of these Levitical laws relating to the harvests, the reapings, etc., were always to be applied once they entered the land. So land entrance doctrines are not wilderness doctrines. So the question I had to ask myself is, are the parables of Matthew chapter 13, are they to be fulfilled during this age that began in AD 70, or were they only fulfilled in AD 70? And I had to answer that the parables themselves will be fulfilled in the age beginning in AD 70. So, and that's based upon the Levitical types. Remember back in Leviticus 19, I believe it was, where it's talking about the fruit trees, how, when you go into the land and you plant your fruit, for 3 years the fruit's going to be uncircumcised. And for the 4th year, it's to bless the Lord, given to him. And then the 5th year, that's when you can start eating the fruit. So these are land entrance themes. Nobody ever thought of planting in the wilderness. They would have been probably stoned if they had. Nobody ever thought of reaping in the wilderness. They couldn't reap anything because they didn't plant anything. So it's important to understand that these motifs have a specific indicator, and that indicator being, of course, land entrance. So any kind of sowing, any kind of plowing, anything like that has to be understood as pertaining to land entrance and not wilderness. So what was the wilderness period from AD 30 to AD 70? The wilderness period, we're talking about a period between covenants. Or actually, I like to phrase it another way. I like to say between dispensations, between the old Mosaic dispensation and the new Christian dispensation or church age. There was a wilderness period of 40 years. During that 40 years, there were doctrines being inculcated, doctrines being promulgated, doctrines being established to be set up once you got into that land. Land being, of course, of the Christian dispensation, the church age, however you want to phrase it. And that's what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with all of those doctrines have crossed over, and that's what we're teaching. We're not teaching anything else. We're not teaching cessationism. We're not teaching, that everything suddenly ended. Now we've got to figure it all out fresh. And even if we did, there would have to be some rhyme and reason, some method to our madness. Which there isn't when you look at the full preterists to what they're teaching. Very, very arbitrary on, what crossed over and what didn't. And I think all Protestant scholars, to a certain extent, honor the constitutionality of the New Testament, although that constitutionality is compromised once you start using time texts to force fulfillment. So once you start saying, well, all these time texts prove that everything was finished in AD 7, well, the whole turkey was finished. The whole thing was finished. Christianity was basically a first century phenomenon. And that is what some people have actually stated, because they're being consistent with their exegesis. When you're not consistent with your exegesis, you get, well, this passed over, but this didn't, because they feel that that's relevant to themselves. And notice how they always read themselves into these new Old Testament, as they call them, promises. So the Old Testament texts, that they say, well, this was the Old Testament, right? We're not in the New Testament yet. We're still in the Old Testament. Well, all these text, they read themselves into them. So they could see that God was looking down the ages, looking at themselves, but they forgot about that church. They forgot about that corporate body. They forgot about that one doctrine. They forgot about that one faith. They forgot about that body of truth, and they forgot about the constitutionality of that body of truth as pertaining to the one body, the church. So it's a problem, and it's problematic. But when we go back to the Old Testament types, we see correspondence, and we see that the planting, sowing, and reaping never took place in the wilderness. So this allows us to interpret these parables in Matthew 13 as applying to the age beginning in AD 70. So the end of the age, what is that? Is that the Mosaic age or is that the Adamic age? Talking about the Adamic age, he's given us grace, he's given us mercy, he's forestalled judgment, there's been a stay of judgment upon mankind. You can see local judgments, you're going to see individual judgments, you're still going to see some justice in this world, because the law was never completely abolished. So the law wasn't completely abolished, you're still going to see that legal principle playing out in the affairs of humanity. If someone wants to be a drunk, or if someone wants to be an adulterer, or if someone wants to be a fornicator, or if someone wants to be a drug dealer, a drug addict, well, they're going to reap the consequences of that, right? So there's such a thing as law, moral law, there's such a thing as natural law, there's such a thing as cause and effect. Those things were never abolished. But what we do have is we have a stay of judgment, a stay of divine judgment. We don't see God thundering, wrath, fire, and brimstone from heaven anymore like we did in the Old Testament. Not to say it can't happen, not to say that he might not do that here and there, but we don't see it happening the way we did in the Old Testament. So we've been a stay of judgment, and because of that propitiatory sacrifice made on the cross, God is postponing that wrath. So we're talking about Adamic age here being the harvest, and of course Christ purging his church, purging his kingdom of all those disobedient children and of all the false tares that have been sown by the devil. We talked about that some other time. He was looking at the land entrance. He was looking at the, sowing in the lands, not sowing in the wilderness. Anyhow, I know it's a short one, but I don't have a lot of time today. Just wanted to throw that out, and hopefully you can appreciate it, get some instruction out of it. But I will try to be back tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks again for everybody's thoughts, your comments, your observations, your critiques. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.